Before we begin, a quick note. This is a recording of a live stream that I did on December 29th in 2024. It's an extra discussion about the workers of Deir el Medina, specifically how they arranged the construction, decoration, and furnishing of their tombs. We talk about burials a lot on the podcast, and we're going to talk about Deir el Medina even more over the coming years. But one of the important questions that we don't discuss as much as we should is how much did a tomb actually cost? How did they pay for it and organize the construction? Today, I'd like to tackle that question and provide some answers based on records from the early 19th dynasty, around 1300 BCE. Hopefully, this will provide a little bit more background to the workers of Deir el Medina and how their lives and legacies were constructed. Because we're discussing tombs, there is a visual component to the analysis. I have cut that out of this audio version because you can't see the art which I am discussing. But if you would like to access the video recording of the live stream, that is currently available on my Patreon, and in the future I will make it available on YouTube. Just check the link in the episode description to access the versions available. Now then, on with the show. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well, and wherever you are, hope things are going smoothly in your country and home. So just a little bonus live stream today. I'm going to do kind of a part 2 on the one I did earlier this month about Deir el Medina. There was a little bit of extra content that I wanted to get into in that presentation, but I cut it out for time because otherwise I would have been talking for like 3 hours. So this is that part 2 on just a little bit extra material and to give a little bit more context for the tomb builders at Deir el Medina. Now that we're into the reign of Seti I and the early 19th dynasty, our records for Deir el Medina really start to proliferate far more than they were in the 18th dynasty. So we're kind of entering the golden age of Deir el Medina. And there's going to be a lot to talk about. But one of the main sources for everything I'm going to be describing over the coming years of episodes are the tombs of Deir el Medina. We get a lot of information from the village itself, from the houses, from the artifacts discovered within, from the way it's all organized and layered, and how people seem to be living. But another major source is their tombs. And I wanted to do just a little bit of an exploration on how they're actually making these tombs. I remember on the last live stream in the question time, somebody asked, when do they actually get time to build these tombs? If they're working on like the royal monument of Seti I or the Valley of the Queens, that kind of thing, when are they actually getting time to do that? So I thought we'd dive a bit deeper into questions like that, in particular, how they make them, and also how they're paying for them. It's not the most obvious question. If you just visit the tombs, you're just like, oh, this is so beautiful. And wow, it's like really elaborate. But there is interesting information and records about how they're actually paying for various aspects, especially the tomb goods, the furniture or the furnishings that go into these burials. Building off that question that a viewer had last week, when are these people actually getting time to build their tombs? So the first thing to think about is that they're doing it over years. It's not a single focus project. They don't start on January 1st and they just go straight through until they finish it. They're chipping away at it in their spare time. So when a royal tomb is under construction, they're digging a corridor, straight down through the bedrock, but that corridor is relatively narrow. Maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 men can stand side by side and hammer away at the walls. But the village itself probably has 20, 30 builders who are capable of doing that work. So if you can only have 4 men working on the corridor at once, digging through, how are you organizing the other 25 or 26 men? Maybe you have them working in groups, 4 at once, and they dig for an hour, and then they swap for the next 4, and they're sort of rotating. Maybe that's one way of doing it. But no matter how well you organize that, you've always got about 20 people who are relatively idle compared to what they could be doing. So those other 20 people are not on site in the Valley of the Kings every single day, every single hour. Some of them are going to be working on the tombs of the Queen over in the Valley of the Queens, and I'll be introducing the Valley of the Queens in an upcoming episode. Some of them are working on the tombs of nobles, like the high-ranking courtiers of the king. They can pay for their own tombs, or the king gives them permission to build in the Theban necropolis. That also requires the same type of work. So the workforce is probably at any one time distributed across the west bank of Waset or Thebes to work on these monuments. But even then, you're still going to have maybe four or five or six who on any given day are idle. They're not necessarily required at any particular construction site. That's the time when these men are primarily working on their tombs. So they're chipping away at them literally now and again over the course of years. And they're using the same tools that they use to build the royal tombs. And they're using the same or similar decorative schemes as well, as we will see in just a moment. But this is when they're primarily doing the work, is like on their weekend, in their evenings, or on their days off when they don't have other tasks. Now, the tombs that they build can become quite elaborate, but one thing to remember when we look at them is that we're seeing the tombs in their final state. So, for example, a tomb like this, Theban Tomb 1, which is the tomb of Sennedjem, it's got multiple chambers sort of coming down, but it's been expanded over time. You know, they start with the shaft and one chamber, and they get that mostly done in case that needs to be the burial chamber. Then, if they feel confident, they carry on down to the next. They open up a staircase and they start the next chamber, and then that serves as the potential burial chamber. But then you have a tomb like Theban Tomb 292, which has multiple chambers branching off. And that's because many of these tombs are family tombs. They are expanding over generations. You know, when they first construct them, it maybe has 1, 2, or maybe 3 chambers for the original owner, but then they start adding to it. His son adds a series of chambers. His son adds a series of chambers. And you wind up with these sort of rabbit warren tombs going into the hillside. But just sort of going back to the question of how are they building them, and, you know, how is this all being organized? The first thing to remember is that they're expanding slowly over time. They are adding little bits as they go, according to a possibility. So now let me quickly run through sort of how you pay for all of this. The first way to think about it is that all of the workers at Deir el Medina are government paid professionals. You know, today in modern Western societies, it's not that common to have professional builders and artists who are employed by the state. At least in countries like New Zealand, the USA, the UK, it's far more common to contract that out to private companies. In Deir el Medina, these are all government employees. The tools that the workers are using, especially the metal ones, those are actually provided by the state. They are distributed to the workers at regular intervals, and then they are collected up again when they become blunt or broken, and they're taken away to specialist like manufactories to be melted down or resharpened or repaired. The Deir el Medina itself does not have at least not a large metal workshop. They might have small individual crucibles that people are using, but the state itself has, at least based on places like Amana, we know that there were large residences and complexes that seemed to specialize in metalworking. So the state would collect the tools up when they were broken and take them away, repair them with their professional metal workers, and then bring new tools back to Deir el Medina for the construction of tombs. But when it comes to the workers themselves, they are paid regularly, which I discussed in a recent episode. Every 10 days or so, which is the ancient Egyptian week, they get a sack of grain. Now, that could by itself provide enough material for you to grind it up and turn it into dough and then make it into bread and feed yourself entirely on bread if you wanted to. But it seems like from the written material that the workers are using a large portion of this grain to trade. They're trading for the other things that they need, which they don't necessarily get directly from the state. based on the deliveries of goods. They're not getting a lot of meat in the regular deliveries. That only comes in on special occasions like a festival. So chances are to get their protein needs, they are trading amongst themselves or with farmers down near the river to get what they need to supplement their diet, to supplement their household, and to pay for the other things they need. So it is fundamentally a barter economy, but there is the way that they're recording it and the way they're acting, there is something like a sort of proto marketplace, I guess you might call it. It's not as sophisticated in terms of financials as we would consider a market today. And that's quite a thorny issue in sort of economic scholarship as to how do you define a market when you don't have, currency. They're still doing similar behaviors, but they're not necessarily thinking about it in the same way we would. And that brings me, that's all sort of a nebulous way of saying that they're getting paid in a very raw material and in certain tools are being provided. But then amongst themselves, they are trading regularly to get what they need. And that includes the tombs that they're building. So in the days of Seti I and Ramesses II, we do have a few records or receipts from people paying for particular tomb goods, like the coffins or the furnishings that would go into their tomb. And we can roughly work out the value of those things economically. So, for example, the inner coffin or a mummy board that goes over the body, that would cost about 40 deben, or about 3.6 kilograms of copper. And that's just for the coffin itself. You would pay an additional 3 deben, or an additional 10% to decorate it. A wooden bed is half the price of a coffin. It's only 20 deben, or 1.8 kilograms. And a wooden door is slightly cheaper as well, which is 16 deben, or 1.4 kilograms. Now, we can't compare the raw value. We can't take 3.6 kilograms of copper and just figure out how much would that cost today, because the value of copper and the price of copper is much lower in modern industrialized societies than it was in the ancient world. Half of the machinery that I'm using to share this information with you has a great deal of copper running through it. Copper is dirt cheap today. For the ancient Egyptians, it was much rarer. You had to go into the Sinai Peninsula or the Eastern Hills in order to acquire it. The mining country was dangerous. It was difficult. Copper was a lot more valuable. So we can't compare that value at a raw level, but we can figure out how much they earned every month and roughly compare that to the price of items. So we can at least figure out the relative value. So in the Ramessid era, around Seti I and Ramesses II, somebody like Sennedjem would earn 5.5 sacks of grain every month. That was the base payment that came to them from the government. Now, the value of those 5.5 sacks of grain is approximately 11 deben. So if we think about that in terms of the price of items, a coffin, which is 40 deben, that's actually about 4 months of a worker's income. Assuming that worker did not eat, did not buy anything else for 4 months, then they could afford one of these coffins. And even something like a wooden door, which Sennedjem had on his tomb, that represents about 6 weeks of income. And then you bear in mind that many of these people, like Sennedjem, they have multiple coffins. He has the inner one, which is 40, and he has the outer. He's spending 2 years worth of income in order to pay for all of these goods, along with all the other things he had in his tomb, which, again, I'll come back to in the podcast because we have, it's an interesting question as to how are they affording these? Are they individually wealthy? Do their families own land elsewhere that they can afford to draw on? I think the more likely explanation is that when they are doing work for aristocrats, like when they're building nobles' tombs, they are probably negotiating prices for themselves. We'll take time off from the royal tomb to do this tomb for you, Mr. High Priest, but you're going to have to negotiate a good price for us because we have other jobs to do. So that would be one way that they're supplementing their income, is with basically private contracts. Another way they might be doing it is if they're trading with each other. Maybe somebody wants you to do a job that is not equivalent in terms of bartering. Like If a builder asks somebody to paint his tomb and he offers to dig their tomb in return, maybe the price is not equivalent. So they're laying out money as well on the side. So maybe somebody like Sennedjem could save up money to eventually afford these nice things. But I would suspect that the main one is from private contracts for the rich. But anyway, if you come back to the sort of the basic salary that they're getting every month, it seems like life at Deir el Medina was not the cheapest, if you really sort of break it down. So a liter of cooking oil was about 1 deben in value. And that seems to be like a sort of similar to like a castor oil. And then something as simple as like a tunic is 5 deben. So that's almost half of your month's salary for a single kilt. Now, to be fair, most of what they're using, well, I should say, in 21st century society, so much of our clothing or the items we use regularly they're now designed to be or intentionally manufactured to become obsolete or to be replaceable. Throwaway society is the casual term. The ancient Egyptians are making things to last. You're buying that tunic for 5 deben, but that tunic is probably going to be made well enough to last you for several years. It's not the equivalent of buying a cheap t-shirt, today. And you're buying much fewer of them. Somebody like Sennedjem doesn't have 10 t-shirts or 10 kilts in his wardrobe. He probably has 2 or 3 maximum. So it's important to remember that the way we treat commodities like these in the modern world is terribly wasteful and has become, but more fundamentally, has become a lot more devalued compared to the ancient world. But you still get a sense of sort of the relative value of things from how much they're paying. So a metal razor is like 1 deben, maybe 2 deben. Again, that's going to last you quite a while. It's not a disposable razor. It's a small metal one that is actually going to last and just needs to be sharpened occasionally. A small wooden box, relatively simple, maybe 1 or 2 deben. But again, it's not like buying a piece of Tupperware. It's going to last you potentially years. A linen sheet, meanwhile, that's almost an entire month's salary for the price. Now, bear in mind that all of this linen has to be woven by hand. These are not easy things to make. They're not cheap items to make. So that kind of gives you a sense of where the true value lies in the difficulty of the work, the skill of the work. It's much harder and more time-consuming to weave an entire sheet of linen than it is to make a small wooden box, which, a lot of the raw material is just wood. By comparison, a chair is more than a month's wages or even 2 months' wages. But a sheep or a goat, less than a third of your month's wages. A donkey, that's at least 2.5 months. And that partly comes down to the fact that the donkey is supposed to work for years. They're supposed to be bringing value into your household. It's like buying a car so that you can work as an Uber driver. It's supposed to pay itself off through the work that you do. So we do actually have enough information to get a sense of relative value in these communities. And what are the things that are actually expensive and what do they value? Something like Shabti figurines are quite cheap, apparently. We only have one receipt for them from the 20th dynasty, where somebody was paying 1 deben, one copper weight for 40 Shabtis. I'm going to assume that is something like these middle ones, which are very low quality. You can buy Shabtis like this from a million dealers in Egypt today. You do have your expensive ones like this Amarna period Shabti, which is made of wood, so more expensive, but also just much better manufacture compared to this little chap. I quite like this little chap, but you get the idea of a Shabti is not a Shabti is not a Shabti. They do come in different styles and qualities, and some of them are very cheap as they are today. But then you have a wooden bed, like from the tomb of Ka, which represents 2 months of a normal worker's wages. But then somebody like Sennedjem, his wife, he has a set of coffins. His wife has a set of coffins. His son has a set of coffins. His other son has a set of coffins. Clearly this family was doing very well for themselves, and they were able to ultimately afford to lay out many, many months worth of income on these particular items. But this kind of gives you a sense of how I've highlighted this coffin to emphasize the fact that, they're incredibly intricate in their decoration. And they are they're not perfectly made. You look at the sort of the lines on the coffin. The wig is not even. The face is a little bit crooked. They're still not working at like the royal level of artisanship, which is fine. You don't need Tutankhamun level quality. But when we're thinking about the relative cost and expense of these things, it's always good to remember, how much, what you actually get for your money. Somebody like Sennedjem is laying out a lot of money for these, and he's getting excellent quality, but there's still, even then, the Deir el Medina workers are still operating at a level significantly lower than what the royals are getting. There's a big divide between even a well-off community and what the pharaohs are actually able to afford. And it's always worth remembering that when we're thinking about the relative inequality and wealth of their society. Even the professional middle class are substantially lower in terms of what they can afford. That's broadly speaking just a little bit about the cost of these tombs and how they're actually producing them on their own. The artists are decorating the tombs of the builders, and the builders are building the tombs of the artists. On their days off, when they're not actually working at the tomb, they're probably doing private contracting for wealthy or powerful individuals, and they're also working on their own tomb or the tombs of others. So hopefully that kind of gives an idea of how these tombs at Deir el Medina are actually made. So if you go to Deir el Medina, if you have been, or if you're going in the future, hopefully now you have a better sense of how these are put together. So that brings me to the end of this particular presentation. As I said, it needs to be shorter today. Just wanted to dive into that, but I hope you've enjoyed. I'll leave it over for questions now. So Alison said she likes the worker level coffins. I agree. I think when you get really enthusiastic or into a particular culture or history, you tend to start out with the fancy royal stuff, like if you're into French history, maybe start with like Versailles and Louis XIV. But the deeper you go into these historical cultures and peoples, I often find pretty much everyone I talk to that over time, people become more and more interested in the non-royal stuff. And that is equally true of the ancient Egyptians. When I first started, when I was a child, Tutankhamun and his treasures were the coolest thing ever, and they were fabulous. And then Akhenaten was amazing and really engaging. Every year, I seem to get more and more into the non-royal, and that's partly because I learn more and more about the non-royal. And it's much easier to put golden treasures into a nice photo book than it is other things. But I agree. Ramesses said there's an image of a sun disk shining down over the tomb. Is that influenced by Aten, or does the imagery predate him? The imagery predates Akhenaten. This particular form of the sun disk with the rays shows up in the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom as well, early New Kingdom, and it's just called the Weben, Ra Weben, or like the shining sun disk. It's like the sunlight coming off it is dazzling. Obviously, anything post-Amarna like this, which is 20th dynasty, you're going to have some element of, how much is this lingering left over from Akhenaten? And certainly there are references to Aten. They continue after Akhenaten is long gone. But the Aten just gets folded back into the standard titulary or descriptions or mythology of Ra. So in this particular case, this form of the sun with the rays coming down, that is an old motif. Richard asks, for their own tombs, would the workers use any other government supplies like pigments and plaster, etc.? I'll field this one. Dominic from the future here. Richard asked an interesting question about pigments, which I didn't have an answer to, but I went away, did some quick research, and I have some more details. The short answer is that the minerals used for paint pigments, those are being delivered by the royal administration. The slightly more complicated answer is that it depends on the color. Certain colors, like black, can be produced with charcoal by burning wood and reducing it down to a powder. So those simple colors seem to be produced locally. The same is true of plaster, which can be produced by pulverizing limestone and mixing the powder with water. The lime within the limestone makes for a good plastering agent. Fortunately, the western hills of Waset or Thebes are abundant in limestone, so the workers of Deir el Medina were able to produce their plaster locally. In other communities, other cemeteries, it might be slightly different, but the written records we have come from Deir el Medina, and they suggest plaster was a local product. So plaster and the simple colours of black or white, those were produced locally. The other colours, though, they seem to be delivered by the crown. For example, there were deliveries of the colour blue called hesped, which is made from azurite. The same is true of green, or waj, which is made from malachite and delivered on behalf of the crown. It seems as though the colours were delivered in their raw state, in little clumps of the mineral or product. Then the artists themselves would grind them up, mix them with water and whatever binding agents they use, and then turn that into the actual paint. So, short answer for Richard, the materials for painting are a mixture of local products and external deliveries. We'll get into that more in the future as our records from Deir el Medina proliferate further and further, but that's an interesting question and I enjoyed looking it up. Alison, could you recommend an additional source for tools found at Deir el Medina from this period? The mallets and chisels both grab my attention, but other tools would be just as fascinating. Do you mean, I assume you mean like just sort of general tools of all types? The best visual resource is the tomb of Ka and Merit at Deir el Medina, the entire collection of which is in the Museo Egizio of Turin. I can put a link in the description when I put this up on Patreon or YouTube to link you to that, because the Ka had a lot of excellent tools in his tomb. A great deal of them also come from Deir el-Bahari, and they are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, discovered at places like the Temple of Hatshepsut and the Tomb of Sennedjem. Lots of excellent tools there. In terms of publications or books, I can definitely put some into the bibliography. So if you check back here, when I upload this to whatever platforms, I'll put some references in there for you, Alison. So Mr. Fox says, how useful from your perspective is the idea of living history? And for example, Guédelon Castle in France, there's a castle being built with historical methods in order to have a greater perspective. Yeah, absolutely. In the early 1990s, there were a couple of experiments funded by the US, the American TV network PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service, I think it is. They made a couple of documentaries with a variety of scholars doing similar things. Like there was one where they got together with Mark Lehner at Giza to test the building of a miniature pyramid. Like it was only like 6 or 12 feet high, but they quarried the blocks, they dragged them with workers, and they tried to put them into place. And it worked. They also did another one for erecting an obelisk to test out the prevailing hypotheses as to how do you actually get an obelisk up. And they did a test, and they figured out a pretty... they tested the idea that had been put forth by scholars. They found that it worked, and they concluded that was a reasonable argument for how the obelisk were erected. And then there was another one which I quite liked, where they got a woodworker in Cairo to construct a chariot based on traditional methods. And then they took that chariot racing around the desert near Giza. And that was really cool. I think at least that I know the chariot one at least is on YouTube. So I'll make a mental note to put that into the references as well. So in terms of living history, that has been done a few times, at least those 3 individual things I know about. In terms of larger ones, so for those not familiar, there is a group of medieval archaeologists and scholars in France who are basically from scratch building a new castle, trying to use the methods that they've reconstructed from medieval texts and art and records to see, one, how long it takes, how difficult it is, and which methods are the most effective or are the most likely to have been used. Because you sort of take a castle for granted, right? They're all over Europe, and you think, oh yeah, it's just a castle. Of course, how they did that. But that is an interesting example where scholars are like, okay, actually, we've probably lost a lot of expertise and knowledge on how those get built. Let's try to do our own. I would really like to see an attempt at that for Egypt, for something like a Deir el Medina tomb would be a pretty cool case study. You get some experienced stone workers. There are still plenty of good stonemasons in Egypt today. Try and take them to a place that is, archaeologically there's nothing there, but it's similar topography or geology to like Western Thebes, and try building a Deir el Medina style tomb. Dig the shaft, dig the chambers, plaster the walls, decorate them. Use a modern artist who specializes in reproductions to try to do that. See how long it takes for a small team. I would love them to do something like that. And, if I ever had the money, I would pay for it myself because that sounds really cool. So yeah, I think living history experiments like that are valuable. Obviously, each one has to be taken on its own merits and what it's trying to achieve. Definitely more of it, please. I would love to see more of that. Okay, that looks like that brings us to the end of our questions, and that brings me to the end of everything I have to say here. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. I will see you soon. I will do one more live stream in January before I make my move to the UK. I won't do one in February, but I will do one in January. And what we're going to do in January, which will be really fun, is we're going to do a 3D tour of the tomb of Seti I. So Seti's tomb has been reconstructed as a 3D model by a cool company who I talk with called Waset. And it's got, you can go through the passages and the chambers and look at the decorations and stuff. So we're gonna do a tour of Seti's tomb in the next live stream, which will be really fun. So I hope you'll all join me for that. And I will see you very soon. Have a lovely New Year if you celebrate the Wepet Renpet in the Western calendar. Otherwise, take care. Thanks very much. My thanks to everyone who joined me for the live stream. And if you're interested in some of the visual discussions, including a whole section about art and the identification of different styles, that is available in the video version, both on my Patreon and, at some point in the future, available on YouTube. Check the episode description for links to the video. Before I go, I would like to thank the priests, my top-tier supporters on patreon.com. It is thanks to the priests that I can take the extra time necessary to research additional topics and produce these live streams alongside the main narrative. So my special thanks to them and to everyone who supports the show on patreon.com. In December 2024, the priests are Linda, Eric, Terry, TJ, Yola, Mycost, Andy and Chelsea, Kyla, Nadine, Ashley, Veronica, James, Arthur, Karen, Siyen, Dan, and Jean. Folks, you are all too generous, and I am in your debt. To everyone who supports the show, either by listening or on patreon.com, thank you so much for your generosity. I'll see you soon.